Neha, and I've been working for the last 6 years in the development sector per se. The way I work is what I do really is I do communication strategy, and I've been trying to orient it to different development agencies that I've worked with. Where we were setting up a fundraising division. We were also just about starting off some amount of hardcore work on sustainable business, which is what I do now, where we are liaising with industry directly to influence them on better management practices, on more sustainable ways of sourcing across that whole spectrum. And we're still in setup zone. So where we're still trying to figure out what kind of a website works, what kind of media orientation works, talking to media about taking us a little more seriously and not viewing us as a green piece. We're trying to break away really hard from this whole conservation and species and tiger cliche that we've gotten ourselves into over the last 20 odd years that we've been in India. For businesses to take us seriously, we need to work at it bit by bit, which is where the communication strategy piece comes in, where we need to produce a whole lot of collateral, where we need to talk to people regularly. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, that is the kind of work that I'm doing. There are huge challenges. There are internal and external challenges. I mean, I'm sure you understand that externally, it's the image and the whole perception of the organization. Internally, there are programs, there are divisions, there are people who've been here for much longer, and whose entire orientation is different to where we're coming from right now. And honestly, the core of our work does remain conservation. So even as we try to break away from the image, there is enough of a sort of resistance to say that, well, that is the real core, so why are you challenging it? It is difficult, obviously, to convince businesses to become more sustainable, because in India we still view sustainability as the more expensive option. In India, we're still at that point where we're trying to convince government to introduce incentives and subsidies to make sustainability a more viable option for industry. And the minute that happens, then industry will be happy to take up at least a part of it, because we're still at that point where it is a little more expensive. Sustainable options are more often than not a little more difficult to come by. Water is a huge issue, electricity is a huge issue, and most of agriculture is still traditional. It's not, they haven't really converted to, say, high-yielding varieties of crops, things like that. So there's a whole lot, there's a mix of all of that, which we're struggling against, which companies are struggling against, and they need to sort of first convince their whole supply chain to move. The commonplace understanding of sustainability comes from a Western idea of sustainability, and we don't really look at what's happening in India. So when we look at the Better Cotton Initiative, we look at the Better Cotton Initiative in isolation, as opposed to looking at things like khadi and taking into account a lot of existing really old traditional practices which are fairly sustainable, but we question their being because, well, there is the Better Cotton Initiative, which is at the end of it, maybe it's a more viable option, but you can start with something small. So you can start with khadi. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the sustainability work here in India at WWF right now is driven by our international understanding. So yeah, so there is that whole colonial dynamic which is also at play somewhere in terms of how our sustainability agenda gets set. If you look at it historically, it's not completely disregarding local practices, because it has, colonial history does take into account all of that, and it's probably better than the American model of sustainability, which has which has no sort of bearing on on things here, and neither does it take into account the whole human dynamic of how things really function in India. The funding is for a large number of projects. The larger funding comes from international sources. At this point, we're still a country that depends, for conservation work especially, we depend either on companies to do CSR, wherein you have an HSBC funding an entire project called the Living Ganga program, where we're working on the Ganga to ensure with HSBC funding to sort of reintroduce species which have died out in the Ganga and clean up significant tracts of the river. Or from international organizations, international agencies like the ADB, like Ford Foundation. I think it's more hogwash, because if I view it in context of the whole triple bottom line, and I say people, profit and planet, I really don't see how how tracts of land close to Kanpur, which don't even have access to a hospital, are being affected, or HSBC is being affected by people living there. So I don't see the connect there, which is why I question the bottom line that they're working with. I mean, I don't see either people being, I mean, yes, planet largely, but that's like saying, okay, I kill 5 people in Maharashtra and I go and make a school in West Bengal. It doesn't, there's a disconnect there. I think there are issues that connect people in the world in general, but I think that those are more emotion driven than issue driven. I'm still not convinced about something like climate change connecting people, because the way that climate change affects me today, sitting in New York with Sandy looming large, is different from the way that climate change affects a farmer who's struggling with no rain for 5 years. So it's just, but yeah, which is why I say that it's more emotion driven connect. Owing is too strong a word, because in India, again, and this is just an observation really, we're sort of taught to just think of the self, whether it's jumping a queue, or ensuring that you're the first to punch in. The whole idea of the self first is very important. So I personally don't understand how I owe something to someone else.